Think of the word good. Feel how solid it is, how obvious, how it seems to name something that was always there. A quality that exists in the world, that humans discovered rather than invented, that points to something beyond preference or culture or power. Now, follow it backward, into the mouth it first came from, into the moment someone said, "This is good," and what they meant by it, and why they needed to say it. This is what Friedrich Nietzsche did in 1887. He followed the word good backward like a detective following blood to a body. In the beginning, before Christianity, Socrates, the moral architecture that organizes Western civilization, good meant something completely different from what it means now. Good meant noble, aristocratic, strong, like us. The masters, the warriors, the rulers, the people with power didn't call themselves good because they were virtuous. They called themselves good because they were powerful. The word was not a moral judgment. It was a social one. We are good. They are just lesser. Beneath notice, the bad were the ones who were not noble. They are simply not like us. The masters were indifferent to the slaves. This is the first thing Nietzsche finds at the origin. The second thing is more important and more disturbing, and if you're honest with yourself, more recognizable. The slaves were unable, physically, to defeat the masters directly. They were too weak, too exhausted, too outnumbered in every dimension of power that the masters recognized as power. So they did something else. They invented a new morality, from what Nietzsche calls resentment, a French word he used deliberately because no German or English word captures it precisely. Resentment is not resentment. Resentment is hot. It moves outward. It wants to act. Resentment is cold. It cannot act. It turns inward. It festers. And eventually, and this is the move that changed history, it transforms impotence into a value system. The masters are strong. Strength becomes evil. The masters are proud. Pride becomes sin. The masters take what they want. Desire becomes corruption. The masters express their nature fully. The full expression of nature becomes the fall. And weakness becomes holy. Humility becomes virtue. Suffering becomes the mark of the elect. The meek, the slaves, inherit the earth. The slaves didn't just survive, they won. Completely, permanently. They took everything the masters valued and inverted it so thoroughly that 2,000 years later, the masters' descendants kneel voluntarily and call it righteousness. Nietzsche calls this the slave revolt in morality. He calls it the most psychologically ingenious act in human history. He also admires it because it worked. It worked beyond anything its inventors could have imagined. And here is the question the genealogy asks that Nietzsche circles without fully answering because he didn't have the historical date in front of him. How did it hold? A moral inversion, however psychologically ingenious, requires institutional support to last 2,000 years. Ideas don't persist through pure persuasion. They persist when power decides that they are useful. In 553 AD, the Emperor Justinian convened the Second Council of Constantinople. Among many decisions made that week, one was declared by imperial decree rather than theological consensus. The doctrine of reincarnation, the transmigration of souls, the idea that consciousness returns across multiple lifetimes, was declared heresy, declared anathema by the emperor, by political power sitting inside a church council, deciding what Christians were allowed to believe about the nature of their own souls. Ask the question Nietzsche taught us to ask, the one that follows every moral system back to its origin. Who benefits? If souls reincarnate, if this is one of many, if suffering here is temporary, not in the sense of heaven and after death, but in the sense that you return with another chance, the entire architecture collapses. One is unable to sell sin to someone who gets infinite attempts. One is unable to sell guilt to someone who understands suffering as education rather than punishment. One cannot sell the priest as a necessary intermediary to someone with direct continuity across lifetimes. One cannot sell the church as the only path to salvation when salvation is a process rather than a gate. The product requires a specific cosmology: one life, one chance, infinite consequences. The stakes must be absolute or the leverage disappears. Remove reincarnation, and then you have one life. Scarcity of existence is installed, original sin, guilt present at birth, before any choice. Eternal damnation, infinite consequence for finite action, the priest, the only mediator between you and the consequence, the church, the only institution that controls the priest. This becomes more than a theology. It becomes an architecture of control. That is the slave morality package delivered at birth, reinforced every Sunday, enforced by the threat of infinite suffering after death. Sin sells. It's always sold, but only if you remove the exit first. The "and" was removed by imperial decree in 553 AD. The "or" was installed in its place. Heaven or hell, saved or damned, good or evil, one life, one chance, infinite stakes. The cage completed itself that week, and the people inside it forgot there has ever been a door. Nietzsche saw the mechanism. He traced good back to its aristocratic origin. He described the slave revolt that inverted it. He named resentment as the psychological engine that powered the inversion. What he was pointing toward, without the date, without the council, but with everything else, was this: the most powerful cage ever built was not made of iron. It was made of the word good, backed by the word sin, enforced by the word eternal, and completed by the removal of every cosmological doctrine that made the cage unnecessary. The genius of it is that the people inside believe that they chose to be there. They don't experience the bars, they experience righteousness. They don't feel the cage, they feel salvation. This is resentment fully realized. That is the hijack at its oldest and most complete. That is 2,000 years of slave morality, so thoroughly victorious that the masters themselves forgot they were ever masters and knelt down with everyone else. What Nietzsche is asking here is, who drew the line? When? One needs to know when. One needs to know why. One needs to know what was removed to make the line hold. And then, only then, choose your values from a place that isn't owned by the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. By your own values, consciously chosen, earned through that hardest question you'll ever ask yourself. Do I believe this because it's true? Or do I believe this because someone needed me to believe it and removed the exit before I was old enough to look for it? That is the question that the genealogy of morals leaves with you. Nietzsche didn't answer it for you. He knew he couldn't. The moment he answered it for you, the whole point would be lost. He just made it impossible to stop asking. That was always enough.